Rain hammered the jagged cliffs like a war drum, the sky split open by lightning. Wind whipped Elena's dark hair across her face as she stumbled backward on the slick rock. Her breath came out in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might shatter her ribs. "Marco, please." The man she loved stood just a few feet away, his silhouette sharp against the storm. His eyes were cold, so cold she barely recognized them. On-screen text, "The man she trusted just tried to kill her." Elena's mind raced. Just hours ago, she had believed her life was simple. A loving partner, a daughter waiting at home, a future that felt safe. But the truth she uncovered had ripped everything apart. Flash, her daughter Sophia laughing as she spun around the living room. Flash, a folder of documents on Marco's laptop, hidden accounts, smuggling routes, names of people who had vanished. Flash, Marco's voice turning from gentle to venomous. "You were never supposed to see that." Back on the cliff, rain streamed down Elena's face, mixing with tears she couldn't stop. "Marco, we can fix this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Think about Sophia. Think about our family." For just a moment, the storm seemed to pause. Marco stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw, the same scar she used to kiss when he came home from work. But there was no warmth in him now, only calculation. "You shouldn't have looked," he said quietly. Thunder cracked overhead. Elena's stomach dropped. "Marco, what are you doing?" He reached out. For a heartbeat, Elena thought he might pull her into his arms. Instead, he shoved her. Hard. Her scream tore into the storm as her body tipped backward into empty air. On-screen text, "He pushed her to die." The world vanished beneath her feet. For a split second, time slowed. The cliff wall disappeared above her as gravity dragged her down into darkness. Wind roared in her ears. Her mind fractured into flashes of memory. Sophia's tiny hand gripping hers on the first day of school. Her daughter whispering at bedtime, "Mommy, promise you'll always come back." Elena's chest tightened with unbearable pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the storm. Lightning illuminated the ocean far below. The water looked like black glass, and it was rushing up fast. Her thoughts spiraled. This can't be the end. Not like this. She twisted midair, trying to grab anything at all, but there was nothing but wind and rain and the echo of Marco's betrayal burning through her chest. Her lungs seized as terror swallowed her whole. The cliff wall flashed past beside her, jagged rocks slicing the darkness. Then, impact. The freezing ocean swallowed her like a monster opening its jaws. Water slammed into her body with crushing force. Pain exploded through her ribs as the icy cold stole the air from her lungs. Everything went silent beneath the waves. Elena sank rapidly, her limbs heavy, her vision blurring. Above her, the storm churned the surface into chaos, but down here, it was quiet. Too quiet. Her chest burned as the last of her breath escaped in a trail of silver bubbles. Her thoughts drifted back to Sophia's smile, the way her daughter ran into her arms every evening. "Mommy!" Tears mixed with salt water as darkness crept into the edges of Elena's vision. "I can't leave her." But her body was failing. Her arms stopped moving. Her heartbeat slowed. The cold wrapped around her like a blanket, pulling her deeper into oblivion. Then, something moved in the darkness. At first, Elena thought it was just her fading mind playing tricks. A shadow cutting through the water, fast, deliberate, strong. Hands suddenly grabbed her arm. Elena's eyes fluttered open weakly as the figure pulled her upward. The surface rushed closer. Lightning flashed across the stormy sky as her rescuer dragged her onto a rocky ledge hidden beneath the cliff. She collapsed onto the stone, coughing violently as seawater poured from her lungs. Air ripped into her chest in desperate gasps. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably. For several seconds, she could only hear the rain and the steady footsteps of the man standing behind her. Elena forced herself to turn. The stranger loomed over her, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat soaked by the storm. His eyes were cold, so cold she barely recognized them. One thing was impossible to miss: a dragon tattoo curled along his neck, its scales glistening under the lightning. The symbol pulsed like something alive. Elena's voice cracked as she whispered, "Why did you save me?" The man studied her silently. His eyes were deep and unreadable, like someone who had stared into darkness for too long. Finally, he spoke, low, calm, dangerous. "You were never supposed to see that." Back on the cliff, rain streamed down Elena's face, mixing with tears she couldn't stop. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the dragon tattoo across his throat. And in that blinding flash, Elena realized something terrifying. The stranger who had pulled her from death was far more dangerous than the man who pushed her. On screen text, "The Dragon Mafia Lord just saved her life." The man extended his hand. "Here," he said quietly. A distant echo of engines roared somewhere above the cliff. Kai's gaze flicked toward the sound, his expression hardening. "And if you want to live," he added, "you're coming with me." Elena's heart pounded as thunder rolled across the sea. Behind them, headlights suddenly appeared at the top of the cliff. Marco's men, searching, hunting. Kai looked back at Elena one last time. "Decide fast." The storm raged around them as Elena realized the terrifying truth. Falling off the cliff hadn't been the end of her nightmare. It had only been the beginning. Jane woke to the sound of dripping water. Not rain. Slow, rhythmic drops echoing through a vast stone chamber. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Her head throbbed, her body felt heavy, and every breath scraped painfully through her lungs. Then the memories crashed back. The cliff, Marco's cold eyes, the shove, the endless fall. Jane's eyes snapped open. She bolted upright with a sharp gasp, only to cry out as pain shot through her ribs. Bandages wrapped tightly around her torso, her arm, even her shoulder. She wasn't outside anymore. The room around her was dimly lit by hanging industrial lamps. Rough stone walls curved upward, like the inside of a fortress carved deep into the cliffs. A fire crackled in a steel barrel nearby, throwing flickering orange light across the room, and someone was standing beside it. Tall, broad, still as a statue. Jane's heart skipped when she recognized the dragon tattoo curling along his neck. The man who pulled her from the ocean. The man who said his name was Kraegor Drogos. On-screen text, "The Dragon Mafia Lord." Jane instinctively scooted back on the narrow bed, fear tightening her chest. "Where am I?" she whispered. Kraegor didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the flames for a few seconds before turning slowly toward her. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. A deep scar cut across his eyebrow. His dark hair was damp, pushed back from a face that carried the weight of too many battles. But it was his eyes that unsettled Jane the most. They were calm. Too calm. "You're alive," Kraegor finally said. His voice was low and steady, like distant thunder. Jane swallowed. "That's not what I asked." A faint smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "You're in my territory." Jane's pulse quickened. What does that mean? Kraegor stepped closer, the firelight catching the dragon tattoo that spiraled down his throat and disappeared beneath his shirt. "It means," he said quietly, "no one finds you here unless I want them to." A chill ran down Jane's spine. She glanced around again, noticing things she hadn't before. Crates stacked against the walls, maps pinned across a metal table, weapons laid out in perfect rows. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a war room. Jane's throat tightened. "You're mafia," she said slowly. Kraegor didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back against the table. "You exposed Marco's cartel," he said. Jane froze. "How do you know that?" Kraegor reached into his coat and tossed something onto the bed. Jane stared. Her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. "You were clutching it when I pulled you out of the water," Kraegor said. "Your evidence was still open." Jane's hands trembled as she grabbed the phone. The files were still there. Bank records, trafficking routes, bribes, everything Marco had been hiding. Jane's vision blurred as tears welled up. "How could he do this?" she whispered. Her voice broke as a photo on the screen appeared. Sophia. Her daughter's smiling face filled the display. Jane's chest collapsed inward as a sob escaped her. "She's waiting for me," she whispered shakily. "She thinks I'm coming home." Tears slid down her cheeks. "But I died tonight." For a moment, the room was silent except for the crackling fire. Then Kraegor moved. Not closer in a threatening way, just closer. His voice softened slightly. "You didn't die." Jane shook her head helplessly. "Marco will come after me, after my daughter." Kraegor's jaw tightened. "He already has." Jane's eyes snapped up. "What?" Kraegor turned toward the table and picked up a tablet. He tapped the screen once, then handed it to her. A video feed flickered to life. Security footage. Outside a small apartment building. Jane's apartment building. Black SUVs lined the street. Armed men moved in formation. Marco's men. Jane's breath caught in her throat. "No, no, no." Her fingers gripped the tablet so tightly they turned white. "Sophia's there," she whispered in panic. Kraegor watched her carefully. "Not anymore." Blanky space. "What?" "I moved her." The words didn't register at first. Then Jane's head snapped up. "You what?" Kraegor's eyes met hers. "My people got her out 2 hours ago." Jane's heart hammered violently. "Where is she?" "Safe." Jane's voice trembled. "Why would you help me?" Kraegor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. He placed it on the bed. Jane looked down. A woman and a little girl. Both smiling. Both gone. Kraegor's voice turned colder than the storm outside. "Because Marco's cartel murdered my family." Jane's breath caught. Kraegor's eyes darkened. "And you're the only person alive who can help me destroy them." Before Jane could respond, a loud metallic alarm blared through the cavern. Red lights flashed across the walls. Kraegor's head snapped toward the entrance tunnel. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Fast. Urgent. One of Kraegor's men rushed into the room. "Boss," he said breathlessly. "They found us." Jane's blood ran cold. "Who?" The man looked straight at Kraegor. "Marco's assassins." The cavern lights flickered as distant gunshots echoed through the tunnels. Kraegor grabbed a rifle from the table with terrifying calm. Then he looked back at Jane. His voice was steady, but deadly. "Looks like your ex wants to finish what he started." The first gunshot echoed through the cavern like a thunderclap. Jane flinched. The sound was so sudden, so violent, it felt like the ground itself trembled beneath her feet. Kraegor Drogos didn't flinch. He simply checked the rifle in his hands with practiced precision. Click. Metal slid into place. Ready. Jane's heartbeat pounded violently in her ears. "You said this place was safe," she whispered. Kraegor's eyes flicked toward the tunnel entrance where distant shouting now echoed. "Nothing is safe," he replied calmly. "Only defended." Another burst of gunfire rattled through the cavern. Dust fell from the ceiling. Jane's stomach twisted in terror. "This is my fault," she said breathlessly. "They're here because of me." Kraegor grabbed a tactical vest from the table and strapped it on with swift movements. "No," he said firmly. "They're here because Marco was desperate." Jane slid off the bed despite the pain in her ribs. Her legs shook as she stood. "What do we do?" Kraegor studied her for a moment, measuring. "You follow me," he said, "and you don't stop moving." Before Jane could respond, the man who had rushed in earlier returned, breathing hard. "Boss, they breached the lower tunnel." Kraegor nodded once. "Delay them." The man hesitated. "There are at least 10 of them." Kraegor's voice turned cold. "Then make it take them 10 minutes." The man didn't argue. He ran. Jane stared at Kraegor, stunned. "You're sending him to die." Kraegor slung the rifle over his shoulder. He knew the cost when he chose this life. Another explosion echoed somewhere deeper in the cavern. Jane's chest tightened. "Where's Sophia?" she asked urgently. Kraegor moved toward a steel door at the back of the chamber. "Not here." Jane hurried after him. "Then where?" Kraegor opened the door. Behind it was a narrow tunnel lit by dim emergency lights. "My safe house, 2 miles inland." Jane followed him inside as the heavy door slammed shut behind them. The tunnel air was cold and damp. Their footsteps echoed as they moved quickly through the narrow passage. Jane struggled to keep up. Her ribs screamed with every step, but the thought of Sophia pushed her forward. "Is she scared?" Jane asked between breaths. Kraegor didn't look back. She asked where her mother was. Jane's throat tightened painfully. "What did you tell her?" Kraegor paused briefly. "That you were fighting your way back to her." Jane blinked away sudden tears. They continued down the tunnel. The distant sounds of gunfire faded slightly, replaced by the low rumble of the ocean somewhere above. After several minutes, the passage opened into a hidden cove carved beneath the cliffs. A sleek black speedboat bobbed against the dock. Kraegor moved quickly toward it. Jane hesitated. The open sea stretched into darkness. Wind whipped across the water. "Wait," she said. Kraegor turned. Jane's heartbeat pounded violently in her ears. "You saved my daughter," she quietly. "Yes." "You risked your men for me." Kraegor didn't respond. Jane stepped closer. "Why?" For the first time since they met, something flickered in Kraegor's expression. Pain. He looked out at the dark ocean. "My daughter was 6, he said slowly. Jane froze. Kraegor continued. "She liked drawing dragons." His voice remained calm, but the words carried weight. "Marco's cartel burned my home while we slept." Jane felt her stomach drop. "My wife tried to get her out," Kraegor said. Lightning flashed across the sea. "But they locked the doors." Jane covered her mouth. Kraegor's jaw tightened. "I arrived too late." The silence between them grew heavy. Jane's voice trembled. "I'm sorry." Kraegor looked back at her. "You're still alive. That means the story isn't finished." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the tunnel behind them. Both turned instantly. Shouting, boots pounding against stone. They had caught up. Kraegor grabbed Jane's arm and pulled her toward the boat. "Move." Jane stumbled as they climbed aboard. Kraegor started the engine. The engine roared to life, just as armed men burst from the tunnel entrance. Gunfire exploded across the cove. Bullets sparked against the dock. Jane ducked instinctively. "Kraegor!" "Hold on." The boat surged forward across the water. More bullets ripped through the air. One struck the side of the boat with a metallic bang. Jane's heart pounded wildly. "They're still shooting!" Kraegor steered sharply toward the open sea. "Let them." Jane peeked over the side. The distance between them and the cove was growing, but the danger wasn't over. Headlights suddenly appeared along the cliff road above. 3 black SUVs raced along the edge. Marco's men, keeping pace. Jane's stomach twisted. "They're following us." Kraegor glanced up briefly. "They won't catch us." But then, something in the distance caught Jane's eye. A faint glow across the water. Another boat. Fast, heading straight toward them. Jane's breath caught. "Kraegor, there's another one." Kraegor looked ahead. His expression hardened instantly. "That's not mine." The approaching boat cut through the waves like a blade. Armed figures stood along its deck. Jane's pulse spiked with terror. "We're trapped." Kraegor pushed the throttle harder. The engine roared, but the other boat was faster, much faster. Jane's voice shook. "Who are they?" Kraegor's eyes darkened as he watched the vessel closing in. "They're not Marco's men." Jane blinked. "Then whose?" The boat surged closer. A massive dragon symbol gleamed across its hull. Kraegor muttered one cold sentence. "My rivals." The rival boat cut through the black water like a blade. Jane gripped the side of Kraegor Drogos' speedboat as waves slammed against the hull. The engine roared beneath them, but the approaching vessel was gaining fast. Wind tore through her hair as panic crawled up her spine. "Kraegor!" she shouted over the storm. "They're catching up!" Kraegor didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the boat racing toward them, calculating every movement like a predator measuring its prey. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the symbol on the rival boat's side, a silver dragon. Jane noticed the change in Kraegor's expression. His jaw tightened. "You know them," she said. Kraegor nodded once. Bloodfang Syndicate. Jane's stomach twisted. "Is that worse than Marco?" Kraegor's voice was quiet. "Yes." Another gunshot cracked across the water. A bullet sliced through the air above Jane's head. She ducked with a scream. The rival boat was close enough now that she could see the men clearly. Black tactical gear, rifles raised, and standing at the front, a tall man with pale hair and a cruel smile. He lifted a megaphone. "Kraegor Drogos!" His voice echoed over the waves. "Did you really think you could escape my waters?" Kraegor muttered under his breath. "Victor." Jane looked at him. "You know him too?" "Unfortunately." Another shot rang out. This time, the bullet slammed into the engine casing. Sparks flew. Jane's breath caught. "They're going to sink us!" Kraegor grabbed the wheel tighter and steered sharply toward a jagged line of rocks ahead. "What are you doing?" Jane cried. Shortcut. The speedboat lurched violently as it entered a narrow channel between towering rock pillars. Waves crashed violently around them. The rival boat followed. Jane's heart pounded harder. "They're still behind us!" Kraegor suddenly reached beneath the console and pulled out a pistol. He handed it to Jane. Her eyes widened. "I've never fired a gun." "You only need to aim." Jane stared at the weapon trembling in her hands. "I can't." Another bullet ripped through the boat's railing. Jane gasped. Kraegor's voice sharpened. "If they board us, they won't keep you alive." Jane swallowed hard. The truth hit her like ice water. Her daughter, Sophia. Jane lifted the gun with shaking hands. The rival boat surged closer through the rocks. Victor stood at the front, laughing as the chase tightened. "Kraegor!" he shouted again. "You always did like dramatic escapes." Kraegor leaned slightly out from the wheel and fired 2 quick shots. The bullets struck the rival boat's windshield. Glass shattered, but Victor only grinned wider. Jane's heart hammered as she forced herself to aim. Her hands shook violently. "Just breathe," Kraegor said calmly. Jane exhaled, then pulled the trigger. The gun kicked in her hands. The shot went wide, but it made the men on the rival boat duck. Kraegor nodded once. "Good." Jane blinked. "That was terrible." It bought us 3 seconds. Suddenly, a blinding spotlight burst on from the rival boat. The beam flooded their boat with white light. Jane couldn't see. Gunfire erupted again. One bullet tore through the side of the boat. Another slammed into Kraegor's shoulder. Jane screamed, "Kraegor!" He staggered slightly but kept steering. Blood spread across his sleeve. "You're hit!" "Still alive," he muttered. The narrow rock channel finally opened into a wider stretch of sea, but the rival boat burst out behind them, even closer now. Jane looked at Kraegor in panic. "You're bleeding!" He ignored her and focused on the horizon. Far ahead, faint lights glowed along the coastline. "The safe house," he said. Jane's hope flickered, but Victor's voice boomed again through the megaphone. "You won't make it!" A rocket launcher suddenly appeared on the rival boat's deck. Jane's blood turned to ice. "Kraegor!" He saw it too. The man with the launcher took aim. Time seemed to slow. Jane's thoughts flashed to Sophia, her daughter waiting somewhere safe, waiting for her mother. Jane's chest filled with desperate determination. She raised the pistol again. This time her hands were steadier. She aimed directly at the man holding the launcher, then fired. The bullet struck his arm. The launcher dropped into the water. Jane gasped in disbelief. "I hit him!" Kraegor glanced at her briefly. A faint smile touched his lips despite the blood running down his arm. Not bad for your second shot. But the victory was short-lived. Victor stepped forward, furious. He grabbed another weapon from one of his men, a heavy rifle. He aimed straight at Kraegor. Jane's heart stopped. "Kraegor!" The shot exploded. Kraegor jerked violently as the bullet struck his side. Blood splattered across the console. The speedboat swerved wildly. Jane grabbed the wheel instinctively to keep them from crashing into the rocks. "Kraegor, stay with me!" His breathing was suddenly ragged, but his eyes remained sharp. "We're almost there," he said through clenched teeth. The coastline lights grew closer, but so did the rival boat. Victor lifted the megaphone one last time. His voice was full of cruel satisfaction. "You should have stayed dead at the bottom of the ocean, Jane!" Jane froze. "How does he know my name?" Kraegor's face darkened. "Because Marco told him." Jane's stomach sank. Victor's boat surged forward again, preparing to ram them. Jane gripped the wheel tighter as waves slammed against the hull. "Kraegor," she whispered in fear. "What do we do now?" Kraegor slowly lifted his rifle despite the blood soaking his clothes. His voice was calm, deadly calm. "We end this." The rival boat roared closer through the crashing waves. Jane gripped the wheel of Kraegor Drogos' speedboat as the wind screamed past them. The coastline lights were finally visible ahead, glowing faintly through the storm. But Victor's boat was closing the distance fast. Too fast. Jane's heart hammered wildly in her chest. "Kraegor, they're right behind us." Kraegor leaned against the console, one hand pressed tightly against the bullet wound in his side. Blood soaked through his shirt, but his eyes remained sharp. "Keep the boat straight," he said calmly. Jane swallowed hard. "I'm trying." Another burst of gunfire exploded across the water. Bullets slammed into the back of their boat, sending sparks flying. Jane ducked instinctively, but forced herself to keep staring. Behind them, Victor stood at the front of his vessel like a king watching a hunt. His cruel smile was visible even through the rain. He raised the megaphone again. "Jane!" His voice boomed across the sea. "You should have drowned when Marco pushed you." Jane's stomach twisted with rage. Kraegor slowly lifted his rifle, despite the pain tearing through his body. "You're going to bring us closer," he said. Jane blinked in shock. "Closer? Are you serious?" Kraegor nodded once. "Trust me." Jane hesitated. Then she pulled the wheel slightly left, angling their boat toward Victor's. The distance between the two vessels shrank rapidly. Waves crashed violently between them. Victor's grin widened. "Well, look at that," he shouted. "The dragon finally chooses to fight." Jane's hands trembled on the wheel. "They're aiming again." "Now," Kraegor said quietly. Jane turned sharply. Their boat cut across the rival vessel's path. At the same moment, Kraegor pulled the trigger. His rifle thundered through the storm. One of Victor's men dropped instantly. Another ducked. The rival boat swerved slightly. Jane pushed the throttle harder. The engine roared. But Victor recovered quickly. He raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet shattered part of the windshield. Glass exploded across the console. Jane gasped, "Kraegor!" He didn't answer. He was focused entirely on Victor now. The two men locked eyes across the waves. Years of hatred burned between them. Victor laughed. "You're bleeding out, Drogos." Kraegor lifted the rifle again. "Not yet." Another shot cracked. This time, the bullet struck Victor's shoulder. Victor staggered back, his megaphone falling into the water. Jane felt a surge of hope. "You got him!" But the rival boat kept coming. Closer, closer. Then suddenly, bright headlights appeared along the coastline, multiple vehicles racing down the cliff road. Jane's heart skipped. "What is that?" Kraegor glanced toward the shore. "My people." Moments later, powerful searchlights flooded the water. Armed figures lined the rocks near the safehouse dock. Gunfire erupted from the shoreline. Bullets ripped across Victor's boat. The rival crew scrambled for cover. Victor looked toward the shore with fury burning in his eyes. "Retreat!" one of his men shouted. But Victor didn't move. Instead, he stared directly at Jane. His voice carried across the storm. "This isn't over." Then his boat turned sharply, disappearing back into the darkness of the open sea. Jane's entire body sagged with relief. "They're leaving." The speedboat slowed as they approached the dock. Kraegor's men rushed forward to help. Two of them grabbed the ropes and pulled the boat in. Jane barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on Kraegor. His face had grown pale. Blood covered the deck beneath him. "Kraegor!" she cried. She dropped beside him as his men lifted him from the boat. "Stay with me!" she begged. He gave a faint smile. "Told you we'd make it." They carried him toward a large stone house built into the cliffs. Jane followed desperately. Inside, the doors burst open, and suddenly, a small voice echoed across the room. "Mommy?" Jane froze in her step, her breath caught in her throat. Standing near the staircase was Sophia, her daughter, safe, alive. Jane ran forward instantly. "Sophia!" The little girl rushed into her arms. Jane collapsed to her knees, holding her daughter tightly as tears streamed down her face. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. Sophia clung to her. "I knew you'd come back." Jane closed her eyes, overwhelmed with relief. For a moment, the nightmare was finally quiet. Then she remembered. Kraegor. Jane looked up quickly. Across the room, his men were laying him onto a table as a medic rushed in. His breathing looked shallow. Jane carefully stood, still holding Sophia's hand. She walked slowly toward him. Kraegor's eyes opened slightly as she approached. "You found her," he murmured. Jane nodded, tears still falling. "Because of you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged outside the windows, but inside the room, there was a strange calm. Finally, Kraegor spoke again. "My war with Marco isn't finished." Jane looked down at him. Her voice was steady now. "Then we finish it together." Kraegor studied her face, then gave a slow nod. Across the room, Sophia squeezed Jane's hand. Jane looked down at her daughter and whispered softly, "Mommy fell tonight, but we rise tomorrow." Outside, thunder rolled across the sea, and somewhere, far out in the darkness, Marco was still waiting.